Welcome to Docker for Development. I'm Lisa Ridley. I'm the Director of Client Success for Savas Labs. We are a web development firm out of Durham, North Carolina. Director of Client Success is just a fancy title for lead developer and project manager. I'm also the automated testing champion at Savas. We have adopted a complete test-driven development process on the last 5 or 6 projects that we've done for clients. So when we're finished with a project, we have a complete test suite, both unit testing, user acceptance testing, and in cases where it's applicable, visual regression testing. This is my contact information on Drupal.org, Twitter, and I will post these slides out on the Atlanta DrupalCamp website after the camp's over. All right, so we're going to crowdsource this slide just a little bit. What is your local development environment that you're currently using? How many people are developing using MAMP, WAMP, locally installed LAMP stacks? Get your hands up, I want to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13? Okay. What about using some sort of virtual machine? Vagrant, VMware, VirtualBox? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. How many develop on a remote server? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. Who's currently doing any development with Docker as your development environment? One?
Does BSD jails count?
Does what?
Does BSD jails count?
You know what? It's a container. I'll count that. Okay, so got 2, and myself is 3. Any other development environments that I missed? Anybody using anything that we didn't cover? Okay. All right. So vast majority of folks are still using local LAMP or LIMP stacks for development. We've got a pretty good sampling of folks that use Vagrant virtual machines and are developing on remote servers. And then we've got just a couple of people that are doing some development with containers or Docker. How many know what Docker is? Just a handful. How many have no idea what Docker is? Okay. Well, Docker it's a relatively recent entrance into containerized environments. It was actually a project that started with a company in France. It was open sourced in 2013. So this is a relatively new player. But it's gained a lot of traction in the last year and a half. And basically what Docker does, and this is, you can get this off of their website, is they automate the deployment of applications in software containers. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that basically you have a software application that's all packaged up in a nice, neat little package that you can just drop in on your server and fire it up. It also has a little bit of an operating system abstraction layer. So you're abstracted a little bit away from the host operating system where the application's being hosted. Okay, what is a Docker software container? Okay, technically it's an isolated user space instance, so it's an object. It contains a complete application, including all the dependencies and components that are needed to run it. So if you've got an application that needs to have curl, you have an application that needs to have ImageMagick, maybe it has to have a certain version in order for it to run. You can package all of that up inside a container and run it on any environment that supports running a Docker engine, which right now is Linux. There is Docker for Mac. There's Docker for Windows for development environments. And Microsoft has actually been working very closely with Docker to get a virtualized environment, a Docker engine-based virtualized environment running on Microsoft servers. So Microsoft is very much invested in this. Red Hat is one of the big backers that has invested a lot of time and effort in the Docker project. So it's getting some traction from some very big players. The way the way these containers work is the underlying operating system kernel for the host operating system is shared with the container. Now, we're not talking about the entire host operating system, we're just talking about the kernel. So whether you're looking at Red Hat or you're looking at Ubuntu or you're looking at CentOS, the kernel itself is relatively the same going from flavor to flavor. It's all of the stuff that's wrapped around it that's vastly different. And for all intents and purposes, a Docker container looks and feels like a real server. Okay, this is kind of what this looks like. So you've got your hardware infrastructure, and then on top of your hardware infrastructure, you've got a host operating system. Whatever flavor of Linux or OS X or Windows that you happen to be running. Your Docker engine is installed on top of that, and then these containers run on the Docker engine. And each container contains the application and whatever binaries and libraries are needed for that particular component of your application to run. You can just drop these containers in. There's a way to network them all together so that they all are aware of each other and can talk to each other. There's a way to expose them to ports that are available on the machine that they're running on. So if you need a web server, you can expose a container to port 80, and you can run your web application inside a Docker container. Now, this is what a container versus a virtual machine looks like in terms of the architecture and the structure of it. So basically, you've got the infrastructure in place, the hardware that's in place, and the infrastructure at the base level, common across both platforms. You have a host operating system for both platforms. On a virtual machine, you've got a hypervisor that's running. This manages this virtualized machine environment that you're going to have running on top of that. With Docker containers, you have the Docker engine, kind of does the same thing in a different manner. When you're talking about running things in a containerized environment. Where the differences start coming in is when you start looking at the individual components themselves. So if you're running virtual machines in an environment, you've got inside a virtual machine, you've got an entire operating system that's loaded inside a virtual machine. For those of you that work with virtual machines, you understand what I'm talking about. For those of you that have not worked with a virtual machine, basically, a virtual machine is a self-contained server. You've got an operating system, whatever flavor of Ubuntu or Linux or whatever, or Windows or OS X that you install inside that virtual machine. That operating system is running in there, and it's running on top of another operating system. Then within those virtual machines, you've got all the binaries and libraries that make up that particular flavor of your operating system, and then you've got your application running in there. Or, more commonly, what you see is something that looks more like this, where you've got a single virtual machine if you're doing development with virtual machines, and you've got libraries and binaries, and then you've got all these applications inside this virtual machine. And when you're doing your development, you spin up the virtual machine, and it has MySQL, and it has Apache, or it's got Genex, and it's got your PHP installed. And if you're running tests, you've got Selenium in there. If you're doing If you are caching things, you've got Redis or Memcached or Varnish, and all of that's loaded up inside this big behemoth virtual machine. And you spin it up, and you're trying to do your development with that. Well, on the Docker side, all of those components are containerized. So I might have an Nginx container, and I might have a PHP FPM container, and I might have a MySQL container. And then if I decide that I need to do some caching, I might have a Redis container in there. Okay, so as a developer, how would developing in a containerized environment benefit me? Well, your development environments are going to consist of components. Your components can be swapped in and out as you need for different clients and applications. So when you're shifting from one client to another, you can have your stack's just going to look slightly different. Maybe you use the same MySQL container and the same Apache web server container, but you've got a different version of PHP. So you just pull out the version of PHP that you were using for this client, you drop in a different version. Say this one's using 7, the one you just got through with is using 5.6. So you just pull out 5.6 and drop in 7. So you can swap them in and out. And if your production environment, and this is where the real power and beauty comes in with Docker, and this is still emerging. There are certain components of this that are mature, and there are certain components of this that are maturing. And as more and more companies start shifting their focus, Red Hat is really a big proponent of this, of having containerized environments where you have applications that you just drop the container in. You don't have to compile anything. You don't have to spin anything up. You don't have to configure anything. It's all done inside the container. You just drop the container in, put a couple of lines of code in here to let the containers that need to be aware of this new container that they're there, and you're off and running. So if I'm developing an application for a client and they're running a containerized environment in production, I can take my fully tested container that I've worked on in development and I can literally make an image copy of that container and drop it in on their production server, and it just works. And it's fantastic. We've got 2 clients that actually are running Docker in production, and one of them is the client that got us started using Docker for development, and that's Duke University. They use Docker to do several of their websites, and we were working on an upgrade from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7 for a pretty big media site that they've got called today.duke.org, and it's basically their main news site for Duke University, and they were doing an upgrade from 6 to 7, and they were running it in a Docker container. And when we picked up the project, they basically said, "Here's our containers for production. There you go." And so we kind of got thrown in the deep end of the pool and had to get up to speed on doing development with Docker pretty quickly. So went through some growing pains, but had some of those head banging moments as we were trying to get up to speed on it. But once we did, we loved it. It's fantastic because we literally just tested the entire application inside the container, and when we were finished and we handed it back over to the client, they literally just dropped it on their production server and they were off and running. So containers as components. We're going to look at this a little bit. So you've got an application, you're running Apache in a container, you've got MySQL in a container, you've got PHP 5.6. You have a client application container. This would contain for those of us that are Drupal developers, this would contain our Drupal instance and any custom code that we might have. And then you've got a client data container. Now the data container might have you might have a data container just for the database. You might have a separate container for your files directory. So all of these components are here. Okay? Well, you decide you don't want to use Apache anymore. You want to use Genex. Okay? All these applications are isolated. So you can reconfigure that pretty easily. Just pull out an Apache container and drop in an Genex container. It's literally that easy. And then just changing a few lines in a configuration file, just so that the other containers are aware that for all intents and purposes, it's still a web server container, but it's Genex instead of Apache. I want to test my application on PHP 7. I've written it on 5.6. I want to test it on PHP 7. I just drop in a PHP 7 container, and if I've maintained my unit tests and my functional tests, I run my functional and unit test suite against PHP 7, see what breaks. Okay, reconfiguration is really painless. I want to put in memcached. I'm going to do some caching. Okay, or Redis, Varnish. These are all, you can find all of these in containers. There is a pretty big ecosystem around the Docker container platform. And you can source these on a site called hub.docker.com, and you can find all sorts of prepackaged containers ready for you to use. You can also build your own. So I want to put in Solar, drop in a container. Change my mind. I want to do an Elasticsearch. Okay. You can find all these in containers, yes.
I was about to ask, do you have to build your own, or can you just...
You can build your own.
That they already exist?
There are some that out there that exist. Now, if you want to get it configured specifically for your needs, you're probably going to want to look at building a Docker container. It's a little bit more of an advanced subject, but if you're just trying to get started with Docker and just you want to get your feet wet with it, there are lots of pre-configured containers out there that you can leverage that people have already built for you. Yes?
Do you store them in Git or something?
They're actually out on a hosted environment called hub.docker.com.
What was your configuration?
Your configuration you would store with your project, yeah. There is a component that wraps around the Docker engine called Docker Compose, and basically it is a YAML file, and we'll look at one in just a minute, that basically declares all of the different containers that you're using, does some minor configuration to those containers for any environment variables that you need to set to use that container. You put it all in a Docker Compose file, you run Docker Compose up, Docker goes out and grabs all these containers, pulls them down, ties them all together based upon the configuration you've put in your Docker Compose file, and spins up your development environment. Or spins up your application. Yes?
Just to be clear, so let's say I have Project A and Project B. Mm-hmm. Project A has a YAML that has the basic LAMP stack and Elasticsearch. Project B has the basic LAMP stack and Solar.
Yep.
Does the basic LAMP stack exist for both of them? Are they sharing the same resources?
They are, well, it depends. Are there differences in the way that you've got the LAMP stacks configured, or are they using the exact same container images?
Let's just say they're the exact same.
Then they will share container image, they will share the image, but they will spin up their own containers. So think of it as a class and an instance.
Yep.
So the image being the class, and the containers being an instance of that.
Okay.
So while they're using the same basic container, they will be two different instances of that container, each one isolated from the other. Now, how many folks have configured Selenium for testing in here? How easy is it? Have you ever configured Selenium for testing? How easy is it? It's no, how easy is it to configure it, to set it up to, it's what?
It's very easy.
I've never had an easy experience spinning up Selenium and getting it to work right. Do what?
I've been working on it for 3 years.
Okay. Well, for those of us that have not been immersed on it for 3 years, I've always had challenges getting Selenium to spin up and run my browsers properly. And it's been some head-banging moments for me. Well, Selenium actually has containers that you could go out and grab and drop in when you need to do your Selenium. You don't have to configure anything. You just drop it in and go, and it's awesome. And if you want to test against Chrome instead of Firefox, you just swap out the Selenium container, the Chrome Selenium container for a Firefox Selenium container. Okay. Updates to your client applications are really easy. So we've got our update script for Drupal 7 sites. We've got, if you're using a Drupal 8 site, you've got Composer. So you do Composer install or Composer update. Well, who likes to run those on production? I don't. So what you can do is you can take your client application, if you've containerized it and you've isolated it properly, you can take your client application, put it on a staging server, run your update on your container, spin out a new container that's been updated, literally replace your container. Takes about 15 seconds to shut it down and spin it and turn it back on to replace the container. So I'm a lot more comfortable doing that in a production environment than I am running Composer update or Composer install or even drush up and have the risk of having things. Who all has done that and had the site go offline and then you're scrambling trying to get the site back online? Yeah, we've all done that. Now, this is going to be a little bit hard to see, but this is basically a YAML file that configures a Docker-based development environment for a project that we're working on currently here at Savas. So I've got my web container that I've defined here. This is just some configuration information. We're using Memcached for caching because they use Memcache in production. Now, they don't currently run Docker in production. We're talking to them about this. And they're interested, but they're actually, this has been an interesting client because they're actually a Microsoft shop. And so we're the first Linux server they've ever had. So it's every time I have to get something done on the server, I have to have a conversation with about 4 people. So just to make sure that, because they're not comfortable with this at all. So they're running Memcached in production, so we dropped in a Memcache container. We're running MySQL for the database. Now we're fixing to upgrade that. We're going to swap them to MariaDB. So what we're actually reconfiguring their entire server. We're upgrading from Ubuntu long-term support 14 to long-term support 16. So we're going to be redoing this whole development environment to use. This container right here is running Ubuntu LTS 1404. We're going to go to 1604 with it. We've got our Selenium container for testing. We've got our volume here. This is a special type of Docker container that is used to store data. It persists. The rest of these containers, when you spin Docker down, they're destroyed. But if you've got volumes, the volumes can persist. So you can keep them around. So the data that's in my database, I can spin this environment down on my local machine. This persists. The rest of these go away. And then when I fire Docker back up, it just reattaches my volume here for the MySQL database. So, all right, so how could you get started using Docker for development? Well, there's a couple things you're going to have to install. If you are, whether you're using Linux, Windows, or Mac as your base machine for development, for local development, you're going to need to install the Docker engine. Whichever one you need to install, Docker engine for Linux, Docker for Windows, or Docker for Mac. All these are Docker-sponsored projects. Docker for Windows and Docker for Mac just rolled out this year, which is one of the reasons why Docker is starting to really kind of take off from a development standpoint. If you're running Linux as your local development environment, you're going to want to install Docker Compose. If you install Docker for Windows or Docker for Mac, you're going to get Docker Compose as part of that package. You will create a Docker Compose.yaml file with your stack configured in it, which that was the file that we looked at. This one's a little bit complex, but there are some out there that are a lot simpler, and I'll give you some sample projects that you can go if you want to start playing with Docker yourself, that you can go and pull and kind of use to get started. And then you run a command called Docker Compose Up. And basically what Docker Compose Up does is it spins up all these containers, wires them all together based upon the definition you've got in your Docker Compose file, and fires up your development environment. The parameter I'm passing in here with the D spins it up in the background so that it basically turns loose of your terminal when you spin it up. Because you can spin it up interactively and watch all of the messages that take place inside the containers as each one of them comes online. But if you do the -D, then all that takes place in the background. Okay, some projects that you can use if you want to jumpstart your Docker development. There is a project out there that's being sponsored by a company called Wadby. And Wadby runs a service that lets you manage all of your Docker instances if you're running Docker instances in production. And they have targeted the Drupal community and the WordPress community. And they've got a project called Docker for Drupal. And it basically is a complete Docker stack. It's got Nginx, MariaDB, PHP. You can either run 5.6 or 7. Just depends on which flavor of PHP you want to run. It has a Redis container that you can pre-configure that you can include in your Docker Compose file. They have pre-configurations for PHPMyAdmin if you want to put an interface there so you can poke around in the database. They have PHPMyAdmin that's already wired into the PHP MySQL container. That's part of that stack. They've got, I think I said they've got Redis. They have a varnish container if you need to add varnish to your project. And there's one more container in there. I don't remember what it is. Yeah.
Is their stack like fully decoupled, or do they actually bundling like the database in the web container?
No, it's fully decoupled. It's all separate containers. And the one thing that it doesn't have is selenium. Easy enough to drop it in. It's like 3 lines. So if you want to spin up a testing environment along with your stack, you can just add a selenium container on there. The one thing that Docker for Drupal project does that I don't like is it uses Docker, just as with virtual machines, you can share local file space with the container. So basically, if you've ever used VM, you can declare that I want to use this directory, I want to make this directory available inside the VM. You can do the same thing with a Docker container. It's a slow sync process when you do that. And the Docker for Drupal project actually does that with the MySQL database. So the one configuration change that we made the first time that we pulled the Docker for Drupal project down and fired it up is we swapped that to be a volume that's managed by Docker rather than local file space, and it's a lot more performant when you do that. There's also, on Drupal.org, there's a Docker-based development environment. I've not actually played with this one. We started with Docker for Drupal, and then we quickly went off into building our own custom Docker containers. But there is a Docker-based development environment on Drupal.org. The guy's got everything hosted on GitHub. If you want to pull that one, he's got shell scripting that actually will walk you through configuration processes for your containers. Looks promising. I pulled it. I'm going to play with it a little bit next week. He looks like he's done a pretty decent job building this project out. There are tons more on GitHub. If you want to Google it, take your chances. They're kind of hit or miss. Most of them do a pretty decent job. A couple of them don't run quite as expected, or the people stop maintaining the projects, and so it's kind of gone into disuse, just like any other project does that's out. Open source doesn't get used a lot. It tends to start collecting dust on the shelf. And then there's Docker Hub. hub.docker.com, where all of these Docker containers that have already been pre-built by people are out there. If you want a Docker container that's got some off-the-wall PHP extension in it, I'm sure you can find a container out there somewhere that's got one of those never used PHP extensions. If you're having to support a site that's running PHP 5.3, which if you're looking at hosting environments, it's getting harder and harder to find a host that will spin up a server for you that's running PHP 5.3. You can find a PHP 5.3 Docker container out there that you can run and support that site while you're getting it converted over to a more recent version of PHP.
For the local development environments with Docker, how does the domain name get configured? Is it modifying your etc hosts file?
Each one of the Docker containers will get, the ones that you've exposed to a port will get an address and that you can then insert in your etc host file along with whatever domain name that you want to assign to that container. The project we've got back here, oh, sorry. Oh, you're going to make me go through all these. Ow. Went one slide too far, sorry. All right. This container actually has a address of localhost, and we've exposed ports 443 and 80. So we use HTTPS for this one, and we've just inserted in our etc host file local.hptn.org tied to 127.001. So, it does not automatically add it. There's no plug-in like you have with Vagrant where it will automatically add them. Somebody will probably write one at some point, but there's not one in existence right now. Yes?
There's actually a container called, it's like jwilder / Genex Proxy, and it runs in a Genex container on your local machine, and it actually auto picks up containers that come up with specific environment variables. And if the environment variable defines its domain, in Genex is listening on your 80 and 443, and then it can actually do auto virtual host configuration to your containers as you spin them up and bring them down. So for your development environment, you can just basically go to, say localhost and and a domain or a name, and it'll just auto route it to whatever port Docker has chosen for that container. So JWAD and Genex, if somebody wanted to look that up, it's on the hub.
Yeah, the port issue is one thing. You'll see on here for this project, we actually defined ports for this one. You can not define ports and let Docker auto assign ports, but then you have to look and see what port Docker has selected for your web server. And the advantage of that is that you don't have port collisions where you've got ports already bound on another project. It'll just pick another available port. The disadvantage of that is that every time you spin down your Docker environment and then you spin it back up, you aren't necessarily going to get the same port again. So that port will change. So which is why we have elected to start assigning them. Makes it easier for developers to configure things locally. Yes?
If you add something after the fact, like Selenium, if you've already spun it up, and you add Selenium to your compose file,
Yes.
do you just run up again, or do you have to spin it down and back up?
No, you can just run Docker Compose up, and it will fire up whatever containers aren't already running.
Question. I think I have the wrong assumption coming into this, because I don't know really anything about Docker, except for what you just said. But so you couldn't use Docker then, say, what I gather is if you had an institutional organization that had like 40 different Drupal sites, all in their own container, there's no way to use Docker then to maybe control, to make sure that they all get the core update at the same time, or for security purposes? No. Okay. I didn't think so.
But if they're all running the same version of Drupal, what you could do is you can have your Drupal component of that application containerized. And then if you need to update Drupal, you update a container, and then you place that container on all those sites.
Okay, so it can be separated out, just that part. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can, depending upon how finely you want to separate it out, you could even go so far as to separate out Drupal core from the contrib modules you're running. Now, that's going to be a fairly high level because you're talking about having directories, and you're talking about mounting data containers at certain points inside your Drupal container. But yeah, it could be done.
Okay.
Are you guys looking into that or experimenting with it?
We're experimenting with it on a Drupal 8 site.
Okay.
We've not done anything with Drupal 7. But we are experimenting with it on Drupal 8 because the directory structures look quite a bit different, and the modules and libraries are at a top level directory level, and they're not buried inside sites default or sites all. They're a top level directory, so it's easier to do it on Drupal 8.
So your initial reactions, or you're liking maybe where it's going?
Oh yeah.
Cool. Good.
Yeah, liking this a lot. We once we got past the pain of learning, getting up to speed on Docker, we decided because we were having discussions as a team, is like, okay, we need to kind of standardize our development environments because we're growing and we've got distributed developers, so we need something that we can support across long distance. Not everybody's sitting in the same office. Everybody's working on different projects. We need a little bit of standardization. We were discussing, are we going to standardize around a VM? And what VM are we going to standardize around? And what flavor of Linux is going to be on it? And what applications are we going to pre-install on it? This took all that headache away. And we just basically drop in whatever containers we need for whatever project we've got running. And what we have decided to do is we've got make files that have certain targets in them that do certain things. And so we are consistent in the way that we declare our targets in our make files. Now the make files are all custom based upon the project, but the targets all do the same thing. So if I want to spin up an environment from scratch, I run make install, and make install does whatever make install needs to do for that particular project to spin up a fully functional development environment. And it may be spinning up one container, 2 containers, or 10. however many we need to spin up for that environment, downloading whatever databases we need and files, directories, and settings.php files and all of that.
Just to be clear, the process of swapping the container that you've been saying is just simply changing the YAML configuration file.
Yep, I just need to stop that container, change the YAML configuration file, run Docker Compose up. If the container is not already present on my machine, it'll go grab the new container, download it, and spin it up.
What's happening under the hood in a production environment when you're doing that?
What do you mean what's happening under the hood?
Yeah, I mean, nobody likes to run drush up or composer commands in production. I definitely identify with that. So what is happening under the hood, and why is it less dangerous than the other techniques that we were just discussing?
Well, running drush up or running composer install, you're running a process that might take 3-4 minutes in a production environment. I can run that offline in a container and have a container ready to go, and it takes me 5 seconds. I basically put the container on the machine, I spin this one down, spin this one up. It's 5 seconds, 10 seconds, as opposed to a 3 or 4 minute process that could break somewhere along the way, and then my site's offline for 10 or 15 minutes while I'm scrambling to fix whatever went wrong. Does that make sense? I can do all the scrambling and fixing offline inside my container, and when I know my container is ready to go, then I can put the container on my site, spin down the one that's running, spin up the new one, and you're gone.
And if you're running drush up against a database, that kind of assumes that there's no production, there's no user content being entered in the database in the time between you run drush up on staging and then you push it over to prod.
What do you do in production when you run drush up now? Do you put it in maintenance mode?
Depends on the site. Yeah.
I can actually get a copy of the data container as well if I need to do database updates, and I can run drush up against the data container and swap it out.
Yeah, on a site that's got just tons of clients, like people logging into the site every minute, even it's kind of not possible, right? Am I just seeing this wrong? I mean, because if you're take a copy from production, working on this little isolated environment to check if the drush up's going to break anything. Meanwhile, there's other stuff going on in prod that is data that needs to be over here. How do we keep that data from being lost if we take this database that we ran database updates on and put it back on production?
Do you run, not because I don't, do you run drush up or composer install in a production environment and keep the site online while you're doing it?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's dangerous, but in a circumstance like that,
What happens if something goes wrong?
scramble.
You're scrambling, yeah. I would rather have 10 or 15 seconds of downtime while I swap it out and just have the site be offline for 15 seconds than be 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever trying to fix what was broken or roll back to the previous version that I was trying to update in production.
While you're working with isolated testing update mode, over here, keep it offline just to keep that from happening, basically.
Yeah, or mirror it. Mirror your database. How would you mirror it? It's an advanced topic. We could talk about it. It really wasn't kind of the venue here is getting you started developing using Docker. So, yeah.
When you run Docker up, can it run like other tasks while it's at it? So for instance, you're going to do Docker up, have it dump the database into someplace else before you've hopped on a new database. Like I'm thinking like in like sequentially running tests, right? So you've updated Drupal. In my mind, the way I would update Drupal is I've got my dev environment, I run drush up, and then I commit to Git, and then on production I put it in maintenance mode, and then git pull and
Pull.
then up DB.
Uh-huh.
So to me, that's, and before I up DB and everything, I just SQL dump into a folder, so I've got my bailout, right?
Right.
So you're gonna, change out a database, presumably with an update, right? So a new container with your database in it?
You're talking about the data or the database? The data or the database engine?
I would think the data, right?
Okay.
The structure, because you're gonna have to, if you run drush up in your...
This volume right here, there's a command built into Docker that I can create a backup of that volume, just like dumping your database.
Okay.
But it's a lot faster.
Okay.
Also, something you could do is like part of like your actual application container, like when it's like starting up, it could actually go through and try to apply any database upgrades that may not be synced with the current database that it's actually mounting against. So you could have like done the upgrades, like she was saying, like offline in this application container. Monitor the status of those upgrades. Okay, everything applied, great. So I'm going to bring my application, the web, Drupal down. When I bring this new one up, part of its startup, it says, hey, are there any database upgrades that aren't applied to this database? And it can actually just do those on application startup. So it could be part of that 5 to 10 seconds, like she was saying. You've already tested that in your offline mode, and now it's just time to make it actually happen right now. And you got, like she said, 5 to 10
Dump the
seconds.
data and then run the database updates as it's coming on.
Yeah, you can with these Docker, especially if you've got a custom container. The Docker containers have what's called an entry point script. That's the very last thing that runs as the container's coming online. You can make that part of the entry point script.
Okay.
So when you spin up the new Docker container, then that entry point script runs, and you can script in whatever update process you need there.
Okay.
Is it kind of like sort of the Drupal module though, where if you were to mess with that entry point file, that you would lose that if you were to pull it back down from the...
You would need to push up a new Docker container. Yeah. Yeah.
So while Docker is great for development, you said you have clients using it in production.
Mm-hmm.
How do you handle the security of it?
Well, our team hasn't had to do that yet because the 2 clients we've got that are running it in production, their IT teams are handling all of that.
Because they leak memory like crazy. Long-running production ones will act like the JVM. They'll just consume all of the memory available.
Yeah.
Plus, it's also very easy to break out of it and get into the host OS.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, we as a company are looking at the security implications of running Docker in production because we see enough activity that we feel that we need to get up to speed on this, and we don't feel that we're there yet. So our team is looking at how can we run Docker securely? How can Docker be run securely in production? Or if Docker can't be run, what sort of containerized environments can be? How do we need to jail it? What needs to be installed to make it more secure? How do we need to set the permissions on the users that are running the user level that's running in the container so that it has enough permissions to do what it needs to do, but it doesn't have excess permissions? So one of the things that you'll find a lot of times with these containers that are currently out there in the wild, and you've got to kind of be careful. And this is why I'm talking about using Docker in development and not talking about using it in production. Is a lot of folks are spinning up these containers and they're publishing them and they're making them available for everyone to use, but the containers are running all of their processes as root. So you don't want these processes running as root in production. So you need to be careful if you're thinking about transitioning things over to a production-like environment. This is why my focus here is we're talking about using Docker containers in development. There's nothing wrong with that if you're developing, if you've got this application running as root locally, because you're not going to be putting that container out on a server. If you're putting that on a production server, you want to make sure it's secured properly.
So if you're taking it from development to production, what's the process? You're talking about containers in the development world, and then what is...
Well, I'm not going to go grab a container that somebody else built and implement that in production. I'm going to build those containers myself so that I know.
You do use containers, you just use your own containers.
Yeah. Yeah, and the clients that we've got that are using Docker in production, they gave us the containers to use for development. They basically said, this is the version of PHP. Here's the Nginx version that we're running and the configuration for that, and here's the MySQL version that we're running, the configuration for that. Here's these 3 containers. Go develop this application for us. So. Anybody else? All right. So that's the last one I'm going to touch on here is this. If you do start using Docker for local development, is a project called Docker Sync. Now, I was talking about when you can share local file space or local file directories inside the container, so that if you're using PHP Storm to do your local development and you're working on your local hard drive and you want those files to be available inside the container, that is probably the biggest drawback that we've seen with using Docker for development, is that native file syncing process is slow. So what we've found is there is a Docker wrapper out there called Docker Sync that basically rsyncs across from your local hard drive to inside the container, and we just fire that up and have it running when we spin up our development environments with Docker. And as we're making local changes locally and saving those changes, they're getting rsynced inside the container. So the container is actually using the files from inside the container, and they're not using the files from our hard drive. And it's a lot more performant that way. So if you're working on a project where you have a lot of files locally that you're working with, or say it's primarily going to see this with Drupal 7, where you've got a whole bunch of modules installed and you want to share those across, Docker Sync is going to make that process a lot faster. It's going to be painful for you if you are trying to work on a Drupal 7 site that might have 200 modules installed, because I've seen them. Then that process can be a bit painful and it'll be a bit slow. But Docker Sync helps to speed that up. That is only available for the Mac, though. This is not a problem with Linux. If you're running a Linux machine for development, it's not a problem for Linux. It's a problem for OS X and it's a problem for Windows. Docker Sync fixes that problem, or doesn't fix it, but mitigates it for OS X. I don't know that there is an equivalent project out there for Windows yet. Probably somebody working on that. And we'll see it, come down the pipe at some point, because Microsoft has put a lot of effort behind the Docker project. So the Windows community is going to have to step up and develop that one. Okay, are there any other questions that anybody's got? We've had a lot of discussion here back and forth. Is there any other questions anybody wants to ask? We've got about 10 minutes.
Where do you store your containers?
We use Docker Hub. We have an account on Docker Hub, and you can have private containers and you can have public containers, just like you would with GitHub. We actually store the source code on GitHub, and the Docker project with Docker Hub, you can declare when you set up your Hub account. And you set up a container in Docker Hub, you can actually point it to a GitHub directory. And if you update the Docker file in your GitHub account, it'll automatically fire off a build on Docker Hub, and Docker Hub will pull your Docker file from your GitHub repository and build your container for you. Kind of the continuous integration process. Oh, and on continuous integration, Travis loves Docker containers. If you're doing your Travis testing with Docker containers, it's awesome. You can basically use the same containers that you're using for your local development, and when you trigger a Travis build, Travis will go pull those very same Docker containers from your Docker Hub account and build and run your test suite against the very same containers that your container instance, the same containers, just a different instance of it that you're using on your local development environment.
How would you customize like an Apache vhosts file? Is that within the YAML file?
The way that we've done it is the entry script for my Apache containers. Part of that is to look for a file in a certain place within the project, and we customize the vhost file there. And basically, what the entry script does is that if that file exists, it grabs it and copies it to the inside of the container when it spins the container up.
Do you guys have like, just out of curiosity, have y'all made any maybe blog posts or anything detailing, say, your like organization of your components, and maybe, I'm just wondering, I just kind of have some information, wanted to know if you had any more information.
That one is on my plate to do.
I understand.
I've not done a blog post yet. I will tell you that we do have one project that you can pull that uses the Wadby project, the Docker for Drupal. We had an intern that we hired, and she had zero Drupal experience, had very little web development experience, and so we did a case study for her using. I don't know if you've ever looked at the beginning Drupal 7 development or the site building book, beginning Drupal 7. There's a case study in that. We basically had her do the case study, and we stood up her environment using the Wadby project, and wrote a makefile to do the scripting, the installation, spinning up and spinning down, and various and sundry tasks. And that project is public, so it is available. It's called the Autism Case Study, and it's on the Savas Labs GitHub account, if you want to look at that one.
Yeah, I use it a lot, in development with Drupal specifically, obviously other things too, but just with Drupal, I haven't actually done any prod deploys yet, and obviously with that, there's a lot of learning and stumbling that comes along, and oh wait, we should never probably do that.
Okay, now this one doesn't have a production deployment process with it. This is just a case study it's a learning thing for her.
Maybe your future blog post would.
Possibly. Yeah, possibly.
Great.
Yeah, we're actually looking at a couple of projects associated with the Docker Ecosphere for managing containers in a production environment. We're taking a good hard look at Rancher OS right now to kind of do that. So we're in the early stages of that. That's something that our director of technology is looking at. We've got a Rancher OS server running, and he's playing with how to spin up and deploy containers in a production environment and deploy them on servers that we have. You have to basically install something on the server for the Rancher OS, kind of like managing Puppet or Chef. So same concept, and so he's playing with that. So. Yeah. Anybody else got any questions? Anything? Comments? I know we covered a lot of stuff in here, and I hope this was helpful. Just to kind of, for folks that didn't know anything about Docker, just to kind of introduce you to the concept and the project and some things that you could potentially do with it, and how, as a developer, it really can make your life easier. We have decided at Savas that we're not even going to have the discussion about doing VMs anymore. We're getting rid of VMs. Nobody's allowed to use LAMP or WAMP or MAMP or anything else on your local machines. Everybody gets Docker.
So have you done, or has you or your team done any exploration as far as like Xdebug and being able to, using some of the profilers out there?
Yep.
Something like PHP.
We have Xdebug running on all of our projects.
So how do you manage the different configurations per container? So like would you have to have like different listening ports on each one of those containers in order to avoid collision?
Yes, you would. The way that we've done it is we've actually declared the same port. We usually just don't have more than one. We spin the containers down, and when we go from project to project, because unlike a VM, which is anybody ever used Drupal VM? How long does it take to spin Drupal VM?
From scratch?
Uh-huh. Yeah, and if you put a Selenium container in there, how long does it take? It takes about, I can tell you from experience, it takes about 25 minutes. I can spin up a Docker stack with Selenium in about 4 minutes. So basically, we just spin them down and spin them up. So we don't have the port collision issues. Any other questions?
Okay, so weird question.
Uh-huh.
Would you ever consider running Docker in a virtualized environment?
That's what Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows does.
Okay.
Those two projects actually install a very lightweight VM on your machine, and you run Docker inside that.
What about like Vagrant?
We're actually, that's the only instance where we might continue to use Vagrant. We're actually looking at the possibility of having a Vagrant machine with Docker installed in it, and Docker Compose, and then running our development environment inside the VM. So far, we've not found a compelling reason to do that, although the issue with the file syncing, the native file syncing I was talking about that Docker Sync kind of fixes, might be a compelling reason to do that. We're gonna do some testing to see if it speeds up file access, and if it does, then from simply an expediency standpoint, we may actually have a VM and have Docker running inside of it to speed that up. Anything else? Well, thanks for coming, and thanks for all the questions. It's really made the session. I really appreciate it. Makes it a lot more interesting, a lot more fun when folks are interactive.